Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's video for our readings and our homily. I'm glad that you've decided to spend some time with me this morning as we hear the Word of God and continue our new worship tradition, strange as it may be. I hope this video finds you well and that you're enjoying this beautiful Lord's Day morning. Our readings today are some of my favorites. This is one of my favorite Sundays in the lectionary cycle because of the really vivid readings. Let's begin with a reading from Genesis chapter 25. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. And afterward his brother came out, with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him, and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Our epistle reading this morning comes from the letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and of death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and to deal with sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, so that the just requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit that dwells in you. Our gospel reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil, and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Now skipping down to verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Hey everyone. I mentioned earlier that these readings are some of my favorites. I like the interplay of the Romans passage and the parable and this fascinating story of Jacob and Esau and all the cultural and family dynamic layers that are mixed up in that story. That one, man, can you just imagine those two brothers going at it? Esau coming in, I am about to die. Give me some of that stew. Well, sell me your birthright. Fine, whatever. Just I'm hungry. I confess I've been just about that hungry every once in a while. We often, and with a good tradition behind us, take these stories, whether it's the story of Jacob and Esau or the parables that we find in the teachings of Jesus, and we crystallize them into these historic events for good reason. Jacob and Esau have this encounter, and it fundamentally changes the course of Old Testament history and the entire history of the people of God in the Old Testament. At some point, though, we have to appreciate the fact that this is a family story. It's a story about brothers. It's a story about social conventions being turned upside down, about how the younger brother winds up being not superior, but in charge of the younger brother. Of the older brother, which is not the way things are supposed to go, especially in the ancient world, where we have firstborn privilege all over the place in the Old Testament. There's a level of commentary in the stories themselves that says, wait a minute, maybe the way things are done isn't necessarily the way of the kingdom of God. I think the story of Abraham with his late birth of Isaac, the story of Isaac's two sons, and how that plays out with this birthright shenanigans they're about to go through. All these stories in the Old Testament turn things upside down, whether it's the younger brother ruling over the older, or whether it's a woman being the hero in the story. That's not how things usually went in the ancient world. All through the Old Testament narrative, we see example after example of how God turns the regular way of things upside down, or at least sideways, to show that the kingdom of heaven is something different. What I want to think about this morning, though, in that same line of thinking, is the parable we read, and how parables are just layered and layered with interpretive meaning. They're similar to our Old Testament stories in that we know at some point Jesus got out in that boat and taught this crowd on the beach. We know that's a historical moment, just like Jacob and Esau had this encounter over the lunch table at some point thousands of years ago. But these parables take on more and more meaning and have been preserved for us by the church for 2,000 years because they have meaning for us today. Well, that's easy, to say, preacher. We want the whole Bible to have meaning for us today. Yes, I know. But in the parable, we often walk this fine line between the meaning we give the parable historically and the meaning we give the parable devotionally. Now, can I tell you for certain what day of the week it was when Jesus went out on that boat and told this parable to the crowd? No. Can I possibly tell you how the parable was interpreted by the crowd when they heard about the seeds being sown on all these different soils? No. But what I can do is offer some insight into how this parable plays out in today's world while still being faithful, I think, to the original message of the gospel. Here's what I mean. We have a tendency when it comes to parables or Old Testament stories to crystallize them in history. We imagine the parable of the sower as this quaint, antiquated story. And when we try to put ourselves into the story, we often put ourselves on the side of the good guy. Whether it's the merciful servant. Well, I hear that parable and I want to be the merciful servant because this whole story sounds like a warning. Or maybe today's parable, and the scattering of seed. Well, I want to be that fertile ground where the word takes root and is strong and yields all this other fruit in the kingdom of God. We have a natural tendency to write ourselves into the parable in the best possible light. Let me offer you today a different way, a different perspective on how to approach a parable, and for that matter, even how to approach the story of Jacob and Esau in the Old Testament. Consider for a moment that this parable is about somebody else. It's not about you. You can imagine yourself sitting on that beach, hearing Jesus talk about the seed being scattered. And while you might understand the vocabulary that Jesus is using, it's not about you. It's not about me. Now, in today's world, very few of us actually go out into a field and reach our hand into a bag and scatter seed all over a field. But I understand what the point is. We're putting out seed. We're trying to plant crops in hopes of a harvest one day. But as we hear this parable, think about all the different characters, all the different scenarios that Jesus goes through. Some of the seed falls on the path and is eaten by the birds. That is not an inherently evil situation. The birds aren't evil. The path itself is not obstinate and unyielding by any nature other than the fact that it's a path where people have walked and hardened the ground. Some of the seed falls on the rocky ground and springs up and is scorched in the sun. Does that make the sun inherently evil? Does it make the rocks inherently obstinate and against the kingdom of God? No. It is their nature to be rocks. It is the nature of the sun to shine and blaze in the noontime. Some falls among thorns. and gets choked out. Are the thorns inherently evil? No, they're plants trying to survive in that dirt just like the seeds that are being sown are. Is the fertile ground necessarily good? Is it morally superior than the dirt the thorns are growing in? Is it better to be the fertile soil against the rocks or the path? All are necessary and useful. We have to be careful and avoid the temptation of ascribing moral value to the elements of the parable when that might not be the point at all. Here, I think, is the point of this parable. If we can force ourselves to be objective listeners, we might just hear a word about the church's role, both in the 1st century and in the 21st century, in Palestine and in Mississippi. You see, it is no fault of the seeds to be scattered on the path or the rocky ground or in the thorns or on the fertile soil. It is no fault of the soils to be either trampled down as the path, firm and rocky, already hosting thorns, or fertile and waiting for a seed to be planted. I think this parable, and many like it, are a call to an identity among the church people. They're a call for how we're to operate in the world, how we're to live and move and have our being in the world. After all, it probably wasn't until 30 to 70 years later when the church actually heard this parable. Consider the fact that the Gospel of Matthew, which includes this parable, was written somewhere far away from wherever Jesus originally said this parable. It was written to a church that was trying to figure out how to be the church in the 1st century and the early 2nd century. Whoever the Gospel's author was, we call it Matthew, was writing to this community of believers who were sorting out what the gospel is, what the kingdom is, just like we are. And I think this parable, and many like it, are a call to the church that we are to be a part of the dynamic relationship between God and the world, a relationship that is determined in many ways by circumstance. Those seeds fell where they were scattered. Some fell in the worst and most unfortunate situations. Some fell in the most fortunate and fruitful situations. So what? Are we to take a fatalistic view and see that all those people around us for whom the gospel has fallen on deaf ears are already locked up and in the grip of Satan or in the grip of evil or already damned from the beginning of the world? And are we to just dance a little jig and say, thanks be to God that I'm on the side of the angels. I happened to be that fertile soil. Whew, I sure am glad. Do you hear how hollow that interpretation is? When we put ourselves on the side of the good guys, on the side of the elect. Maybe this parable and those like it is a call instead to be the church. A church that goes out with a rake and tries to rescue as many of those seeds. It tries to plant as many as it can in whatever soil is available. That tries to cultivate our world where the gospel can grow. Rather than taking a once and for all settled view where the seed has been scattered and oh, thanks be to God, I'm on the side of the fertile ground. I feel sorry for all those people that are rocks or eaten up by birds or have to grow up amongst thorns. Oh, thanks be to God, I'm so blessed. When it might just be a call to action. To see just how wide the seed of the gospel has been scattered. And to take up the gardening tools. To go out into the world and cultivate as much of it as possible so that those seeds are not wasted. And so that more and more might be fruitful. Amen. May God bless you and keep you. May God cause his countenance to rise upon you. May God cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace. Amen.